They used massive robots to flatten my family's land to build their own private residential area, completely unaware that this land was inherited from my father and that I have all the legal documents to prove it. What would you do in this situation? I need to reclaim the land that rightfully belongs to my family. Share your thoughts in the comments. The sharp slam of a car door pulled me from my afternoon nap on the porch. I blinked against the sun, rubbing my eyes as a woman in a crisp navy blue blazer marched up my gravel driveway. Her heels wobbled slightly on the uneven ground, but she kept moving forward with purpose. My old border collie, Hank, barely lifted his head from his spot by the rocking chair. "Excuse me, you there," she called, waving a bright yellow envelope in the air. "Are you the owner of this property?" I stood, stretching the stiffness from my back after a long morning of fixing the irrigation system. "Yes, ma'am. Name's Thomas Reed. My family's been working this land for 3 generations. What can I do for you?" She looked me up and down, her mouth twisting ever so slightly like she smelled something unpleasant. "Eleanor Sutton, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This is an official notice of violation." She shoved the envelope toward me, but I didn't take it just yet. "Violation? Ma'am, I'm not part of your HOA." Eleanor's expression barely changed, but her voice took on that patient, clipped tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Your property is visible from several homes in our community. That structure," she gestured toward my grandfather's old red barn, "is negatively impacting property values by an estimated 12%. We need it painted or removed within 30 days. I turned to look at the barn. Sure, the paint had faded and a few shingles needed fixing, but it was sturdy, functional. It had stood there since 1941. "This barn was here long before your development went up last year," I said, finally taking the envelope. "Times change, Mr. Reed. The Whispering Pines community expects certain standards." She pointed to the paper. "It's all outlined there, along with the potential fines." I kept my temper in check. "With all due respect, your HOA rules don't apply to my land." Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see about that." She glanced past me toward the east field where my winter wheat had just started sprouting. "What exactly are you growing over there?" "Same as always, wheat." She made a note in her phone. "Interesting. The board will want to know about this." Then, without another word, she turned and click-clacked back to her SUV. That night, I was in the middle of making chili when my phone rang. Rick Dawson, county clerk and my childhood best friend, sounded out of breath. "Tom, you sitting down? What's up, snake in your office again?" I chuckled, remembering the time a garden snake had sent him climbing onto his desk. "I wish. Listen, Eleanor Sutton was just here. She filed permits to develop part of your land." I nearly dropped my spoon. "Come again." "She claims your east field, where your wheat's planted, was never properly registered when your granddad bought the adjoining parcels. Says it's actually community land. They've got permits to start clearing it tomorrow morning." "That's impossible. I have the original deeds." "She had documents, too. Something's off, but they were filed and stamped correctly." "Rick, that's 50 acres of my land. They can't just bulldoze my crop." I tried to slow it down, but they had all the right signatures. "You better find those deeds. Fast." As soon as I hung up, I rushed to the old filing cabinet in my office. Well, the corner of my living room where I kept my farm paperwork. My hands shook as I flipped through the folders. There it was, the original 1941 deed, plus the additional parcels my grandfather had purchased in the 50s. I spread them across the table, double-checking every boundary. Everything looked right until I compared them to a survey from 5 years ago when I'd considered selling a small portion. A discrepancy. Just 15 feet, a minor shift from the original survey. At the time, I'd chalked it up to modern equipment being more precise. Could Eleanor have used that small difference to claim part of my land? I tried calling Rick back, but it went to voicemail. Then I called the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Davis speaking." "Sheriff, it's Tom Reed. I need help. The HOA is planning to bulldoze part of my wheat field tomorrow morning. They don't own that land." There was a long pause. "Ah, Tom. Yeah, I got a call about that today. Sounds like a property line dispute with the new development." "It's not a dispute. They're trying to steal my land." "Now, let's not throw around accusations. Tell you what, I'll come out first thing tomorrow, make sure everything's legal before any machinery moves." I thanked him, but something about his hesitation made my stomach turn. Sheriff Davis had known my family for decades. Why was he acting like this was just a paperwork mix-up? As the sun set, I sat on my porch, staring across the road at the fancy houses of Whispering Pines. What was Eleanor really after? The east field wasn't even visible from the development. Then it hit me. Water rights. My property controlled access to Pine Creek, the only reliable water source in this part of the county. The new development had been struggling with low water pressure all summer. I'd heard complaints at the feed store. Were they trying to take my land to get access to the creek? I barely slept that night. At dawn, I was pouring my second cup of coffee when I heard it. A low, rumbling noise in the distance. Not tractors. These were heavier. I ran outside just in time to see 3 massive bulldozers rolling down the access road toward my east field. Eleanor's SUV led the way, followed by a line of HOA board members in matching polo shirts, sipping coffee like they were watching a parade. I sprinted toward them, waving my arms. "Hey, stop! This is private property." The first bulldozer crashed through my fence, flattening my wheat. Eleanor stepped out of her SUV, smiling as she smoothed down her blazer. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. We're finally addressing the community eyesore situation." I pointed at the destruction. "That's my crop. That wheat was supposed to feed hundreds of people." Eleanor sighed, like I was being difficult on purpose. "Actually, according to county records, this section was never properly registered to your family. It's been designated as community land for decades." She pulled a folder from her designer tote bag, flipping to a map with red marker lines dividing my land in half. "That's impossible," I said. "I have the original deeds." "Well, these are the official records." She smiled, snapping the folder shut before I could get a good look. "We're creating something beautiful here. A community garden, walking paths, even a koi pond. Property values will rise at least 8% once this mess is gone." I pulled out my phone, hands shaking. "This is theft. This is destruction of private property." "It's progress," she corrected. Sheriff Davis finally answered on the 4th ring. "Sheriff, they're destroying my land right now. I need officers here immediately." A long pause, then carefully. "Tom, from what I'm seeing in the system, this looks like a civil property dispute. We can't intervene without a court order." My stomach dropped. "They're trespassing. They're bulldozing my wheat. The property lines are unclear." I looked up from my phone. Eleanor was watching me, smirking. She knew exactly how this conversation had gone. I clenched my jaw. "The sheriff is on his way," I lied. "Wonderful," Eleanor said. "He can see our permits." She handed me a stack of official-looking documents, stamped and approved by the county last month. "This isn't over," I growled. She placed a condescending hand on my shoulder. "It actually is." Then she turned, gesturing for the bulldozers to keep going. I stood there, fists clenched, watching as the bulldozers ripped through my field. The golden wheat, months of hard work, crushed under the massive machines like it was nothing. My heart pounded, my breath came fast, but I forced myself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't stop them. I needed proof, evidence, a way to fight back. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos and videos. The destruction, the bulldozers, the smug look on Eleanor's face as she sipped her coffee, all of it. If the sheriff wouldn't step in, I'd make damn sure there was a record of this. Rick's truck tore up my driveway 10 minutes later, dust kicking up behind his tires. He jumped out, face pale. "Tom, I came as soon as I heard. This is insane. How the hell did they get permits for this?" I shook my head, still staring at the wreckage. Someone at the county office helped them. The paperwork is fake or twisted just enough to make it look real. But I have my deeds, Rick. They can't just take my land. He rubbed his face. It's not just your land, Tom. On my way here, I saw surveyors over at your north field. They had Whispering Pines HOA logos on their truck. My blood ran cold. They weren't stopping. This wasn't just about my east field. They wanted more. I stormed back into my house, throwing open the heavy safe behind my grandfather's old desk. Inside were the original property documents, bound in worn leather folders. My great-grandfather had been meticulous, recording everything from land purchases to water rights. As I flipped through, something caught my eye. A map from 1954 stamped with the county seal, clearly showing that not only did my family own the East Field, our property extended far beyond what the HOA was claiming. But that wasn't the most important part. Scribbled in my grandfather's careful handwriting were 2 words: water rights. My stomach tightened. This wasn't about community gardens or koi ponds. It was about control. My property sat on the only reliable water source for miles. Whispering Pines had been struggling with water pressure issues for months. I'd heard the complaints in town, the whispers that new restrictions might be coming. Eleanor wasn't just after my land, she was after the creek. And if she controlled the water, she controlled everything. I grabbed my files and called my old college roommate Sandra, who now worked as a real estate lawyer in Denver. "How fast can you get here?" I asked, voice tight. "Tom, what's going on?" she asked. "The HOA is trying to steal my land, and I just found proof they might be breaking more laws than they realize. I need you here. Now." She sighed. "I can be there by morning. Don't do anything stupid before then." By the time the sun started setting, my field was ruined. Acres of wheat gone. Eleanor and her board members had left, but not before hammering a massive sign into my soil. Future home of the Whispering Pines Community Garden and Wellness Center. My hands shook as I ripped it out of the ground. This wasn't over. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, poring over the documents, searching for anything I could use. Around 2 a.m., I found it. A clause buried in the old land agreements stating that my great-grandfather had granted conditional easements to surrounding developments for water access. But there was a catch. The easements were only valid as long as the land remained agricultural. If the land was developed for commercial or residential purposes, the rights reverted back to the original owner. That meant the second they bulldozed my field, they violated the agreement. Legally, I could cut off their water supply. The next morning, Sandra pulled into my driveway, stepping out of her car with a steaming coffee in one hand and a thick binder in the other. "All right, let's see what we've got," she said, setting up at my kitchen table. I laid everything out for her, the deeds, the maps, the easement agreements. She flipped through them, her expression shifting from confusion to realization to something that almost looked like excitement. "Tom," she said slowly, tapping a page, This is a big deal. If we can prove they knowingly violated the water rights agreement, not only can you shut off their access, you might be able to sue them for damages." I nodded. "I don't want money. I want them to stop." She closed the binder. "Then let's hit them where it hurts." That night, the HOA held an emergency meeting at their clubhouse to discuss Phase 2 of their development. Sandra and I arrived just as Eleanor was stepping up to the podium, her expression smug as she clicked through slides showing new development plans. I stayed in the back, arms crossed, waiting for my moment. And with Phase 2, we will extend our beautiful community spaces, increasing property values and ensuring Whispering Pines remains the most desirable neighborhood in the county, she said, smiling as a few board members clapped. Then I stepped forward. "Before you get too far ahead of yourselves, I have a few things to say." The room fell silent. Eleanor's smile tightened. "Mr. Reed, this is a private HOA meeting." I ignored her, setting a stack of documents on the table at the front. My name is Thomas Reed. My family has farmed this land for nearly a century. And you, I pointed at Eleanor, just destroyed acres of my crops under the false claim that you own my land. But there's a problem with that. I have the original deeds proving you're lying." Murmurs filled the room. A few homeowners whispered to each other, their expressions shifting. Eleanor let out a small laugh. "Mr. Reed, our records clearly show that—" "Your records were falsified," I cut her off. "But let's put that aside for now. There's something bigger at stake here." I pulled out the easement agreement and placed it on the projector. This document, signed in 1954, proves that the water running to Whispering Pines only flows because my family granted it, under very specific conditions. One of those conditions: the land must remain agricultural. I leaned in. "The moment you bulldozed my field, you broke that agreement, which means, as of this moment, I have full legal authority to cut off your water supply." The room exploded. Homeowners stood up, shouting questions. One man, wearing a golf polo and an expensive watch, turned to Eleanor. "Is this true? Can he do that?" Eleanor's face was pale. "This is ridiculous. Our legal team—" Sandra stepped up beside me. "Your legal team might want to check again because Mr. Reed is well within his rights. And if this goes to court, not only will you lose, but every homeowner here might face serious consequences for being misled by their own HOA." A woman in the front row, holding a baby, looked horrified. "Are we going to lose our homes?" I softened my voice. "Number. That's not my goal, but the destruction of my land has to stop, and the people responsible need to be held accountable." A commotion near the entrance made everyone turn. Sheriff Davis walked in, followed by Rick and 2 county officials. Rick held up a folder marked "Evidence." Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. "This meeting is now under investigation. We have reason to believe property records were falsified, and we're going to get to the bottom of it." Panic spread across Eleanor's face as she started frantically texting on her phone. A few board members stood, looking just as nervous. Doug Wilson, her right-hand man, grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. His voice was low, furious. "You have no idea who you're messing with. Eleanor's husband is a state senator. This stunt is going to cost you everything." I pulled my arm free. "I'm not the one who bulldozed someone else's land based on forged documents. But you might want to start looking for a lawyer." Doug's grip tightened for a moment before he let go. His jaw clenched. His eyes flicked toward Eleanor, who was still furiously typing on her phone. The room had shifted. The homeowners weren't just confused anymore, they were angry. People were murmuring, demanding answers, asking why they hadn't been told about the water easements, why their HOA dues had been rising for years without explanation. A man in the front row stood up, shaking the stack of documents I had placed on the table. "Is this why our water bills have been so high? Because you people have been running some backdoor deal?" Eleanor finally looked up, smoothing her blazer like she could straighten out the situation with the same ease. "There is no cause for concern. We have the best interests of the community in mind and—" "Cut the crap, Eleanor," another homeowner snapped. "We trusted you. We trusted this HOA, and now it turns out you've been lying to us?" A few others nodded, their faces shifting from uncertainty to full-blown outrage. The HOA board members who had been standing by her were starting to inch away, suddenly aware of just how precarious their situation had become. Eleanor straightened, regaining some of her composure. "This meeting is over. Any concerns can be directed to our legal team." She turned sharply, heels clicking against the floor as she pushed past Doug and headed for the exit. Sheriff Davis stepped in front of her, arms crossed. "Not so fast, Mrs. Sutton. We're going to need you to stay for some questioning." Her face paled for just a second before she forced a smile. "Of course, Sheriff. I'm happy to cooperate." But her fingers were still gripping that phone like a lifeline, and I had a feeling she was already planning her next move. As the homeowners kept shouting questions, I slipped out of the meeting, Sandra right behind me. Rick followed a second later, shaking his head. "This is going to get ugly," he muttered. "You think?" I said dryly. "They're not going to let this go, Tom. Eleanor's got connections, money. She's not just going to roll over." I nodded, already knowing he was right. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, and I didn't have to wait long to see just how far they'd go. That night, I barely got 2 hours of sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bulldozers tearing through my field, Eleanor's smug smile, Doug's warning. Sometime around 3 a.m., I gave up and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the maps spread out in front of me. My family had built this farm from nothing. My great-grandfather had fought tooth and nail for this land, and I'd be damned if I was going to let some HOA steal it out from under me. I was still at the table, sipping on my 4th cup of coffee when I heard it, the distant sound of sirens. My stomach dropped. I was out the door before I even had my boots on all the way, sprinting toward the glow of flashing red and blue lights. My barn. My century-old barn. Flames licked up the sides, casting an eerie glow against the night sky. Firefighters were already on scene, dousing the blaze with water, but it was too late. The wood was too old, too dry. It went up like kindling. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. This wasn't an accident. This was retaliation. Someone had sent a message. Rick pulled up next to me, jumping out of his truck. "Tom, Jesus, are you okay?" I didn't answer, my eyes locked on the inferno. Sheriff Davis approached, looking grim. "We'll investigate, but what?" I snapped. "You think this was some freak accident? Some coincidence?" His mouth tightened. "No, I don't. But proving it is another thing." I turned, scanning the crowd of onlookers. And then I saw it. A black SUV parked just beyond the fire trucks. Eleanor sitting in the driver's seat, watching. The second our eyes met, she smirked, and then she drove away. The next morning, I was back at Rick's office before the sun was even up. "We need to hit back. Hard," I said, slamming my hands on his desk. He ran a hand through his hair. "Tom, I get it, but we have to be smart. We can't just accuse them without proof." "Then let's get proof." Sandra walked in, setting her briefcase on the table. "Already working on it." She opened it, pulling out a stack of documents. I spent the last 6 hours combing through Whispering Pines financials. And guess what? Eleanor and a few other board members have been buying up properties in the development. For dirt cheap. Whenever a homeowner violates some ridiculous HOA rule, they slap them with fines until they can't afford to stay. Then they buy the properties at foreclosure rates and flip them for profit. My jaw tightened. And let me guess, those new community projects they've been pushing. Just an excuse to drive people out. Sandra nodded. Exactly. And it gets worse. The land they bulldozed? It sits directly above a natural spring, the most valuable water source in the entire county. I exhaled sharply. So this was never about a garden. It was about controlling the water supply, controlling the town. Rick looked at me. "So, what's the plan?" I set my jaw. "We take everything they've built and set it on fire." Not literally, of course. I'd never stooped to their level. But we were going to burn their entire operation to the ground. By noon, we had everything we needed. Financial records, forged documents, water rights agreements, testimonies from homeowners who had been forced out. We weren't just going after the HOA anymore. We were going after Eleanor herself. That evening, we held a town meeting. This time, it wasn't in some fancy HOA clubhouse. It was at the county courthouse, and everyone showed up. Farmers, longtime residents, even people from Whispering Pines who had started to realize they'd been lied to. I stood in front of the crowd, laid out the truth, piece by piece, showed them the documents, the fraudulent land deals, the illegal fines, the water scheme. Showed them how they'd all been played. By the time I was done, the room was in an uproar. And Eleanor, she was nowhere to be seen. By the end of the week, everything had fallen apart for her. The county launched a full investigation into the HOA. The sheriff's office issued warrants for multiple board members. Eleanor's accounts were frozen. And Whispering Pines? Without the water rights, without their corrupt leadership, the entire development started to crumble. Homeowners demanded a new board. Rules were rewritten. The HOA's stranglehold on the community was broken. And me? I got my land back. A few months later, I stood at the edge of my field, watching as the first green shoots of wheat started to push through the soil. My barn was gone, but we'd rebuild. The farm would go on. Rick stood beside me, hands in his pockets. "You did it, Tom." I nodded, watching the wind ripple across the land. We did it. Across the road, a moving truck pulled away from what used to be Eleanor's house. She was gone. Her empire, her control, her smug little smirk, all of it wiped away. She had tried to take everything from me, and in the end, she lost it all.